Stream Terrorism Today.txt Notepad window focused on common elements of terrorism. There is clearly a wide choice of definitions for terrorism. Despite this, there are elements in common among the majority of useful definitions. Common threads of the various definitions identify terrorism as political, psychological, violent, dynamic, deliberate, political. A terrorist act is a political act or is committed with the intention to cause a political effect. Clause's statement that war is a continuation of policy by other means is taken as a truism by terrorists. They merely eliminate the intermediate step of armies and warfare and apply violence directly to the political contest. 31 Over a decade ago, the U.S. State Department official summarized the ultimate goals of terrorism are politically motivated terrorism invariably involves a deeply held grievance over some form of injustice. The injustice may be social or economic, but it is nonetheless blamed on a political authority. 30 to psychological. The intended results of terrorist acts cause a psychological effect error. They are aimed at a target audience other than the actual victims of the act. The intended target audience of the terrorist act may be the population as a whole, some specific portion of a society, an ethnic minority. For example, similar to the situation in Kosovo between the Serbs and Albanians, or decision-making elites in the society's political, social, or military populace. Violence, coercion, and destruction are used in the commission of the act to produce the desired effect. Even if casualties or destruction are not the result of a terrorist operation, the threat or potential of violence is what produces the intended effect. For example, a successful hostage-taking operation may result in all hostages being freed unharmed after negotiations and bargaining. Regardless of the outcome, the terrorist bargaining chips were nothing less than the raw threat of applying violence to aim or kill some or all of the hostages. When the threat of violence is not credible, or the terrorists are unable to implement violence effectively, terrorism fails. Dynamic terrorist groups demand change, revolution, or political movement. The radical worldview that justifies terrorism mandates drastic action to destroy or alter the status quo. Even if the goals of the movement are reactionary in nature, they require action to turn back the clock or restore some cherished value system that is extinct. Nobody commits violent attacks on strangers or innocents to keep things just the way they are. Deliberate terrorism is an activity planned and intended to achieve particular goals. It is a rationally employed, specifically selected tactic, and is not a random fact. 33 Since the victims of terrorist violence are often of little import, with one being as good for the terrorists' purposes as another, Victim or target selection can appear random or unprovoked, but the target will contain symbolic value or be capable of eliciting emotional response according to the terrorist's goals. Remember that the actual target of terrorism is not necessarily the victim of the violence, but the psychological impact on the society or population. This psychological impact is intended to create an environment of fear and intimidation that terrorists can then manipulate to force others to submit or agree to their demands. Media exploitation, as stated earlier. Terrorism's effects are not necessarily aimed at the victims of terrorist violence. Victims are usually objects to be exploited by the terrorists for their effect on a third party. In order to produce this effect, information of the attack must reach the target audience. So any terrorist organization plans for exploitation of available media to get the message to the right audiences. 34 victims are simply the first medium that transmits the psychological impact to the larger target audience. The next step in transmission will depend on what media is available, but it will be planned, and it will frequently be the responsibility of a specific organization within a terrorist group to do nothing else but exploit and control the news cycle. 35 Some organizations can rely on friendly or sympathetic news outlets, but this is not necessary. News media can be manipulated by planning around the demands of the news cycle, and the advantage that control of the initiative gives the terrorist pressures to report quickly, to scoop competitors, allow terrorists to present claims or make statements that might be refuted or critically commented on at times were available. Terrorists often provide names and details of individual victims to control the news media through its desire to humanize or personalize the story. For the victims of a terrorist attack, it is a certainty that the impact on the survivors, if there are any, is of minimal importance to the terrorists. What is important is the intended psychological impact that the news of their death or suffering will cause in a wider audience. Terrorists conduct more operations in societies where individual rights and civil legal protection prevail, while terrorists may base themselves in repressive regimes that are sympathetic to them. They usually avoid repressive governments when conducting operations wherever possible. An exception to this case is a repressive regime that does not have the means to enforce security measures. Governments with effective security forces and few guaranteed civil liberties have typically suffered much less from terrorism than liberal states with excellent security forces. All key data has shown, however, that they will conduct operations anywhere. Governmental or state terror. This is sometimes referred to as terror from above, where the government terrorizes its own population to control or repress them. These actions usually do not constitute the acknowledged policy of the government and make use of official institutions such as the judiciary, police, military, and other government agencies. Changes to legal codes permit or encourage torture, killing, or property destruction in pursuit of government policy. After assuming power, official Nazi policy was aimed at the deliberate destruction of state enemies and the resulting intimidation of the rest of the population. Stalin's purges of the 1930s are examples of using the machinery of the state to terrorize the population. The methods he used included such actions as rigged show trials of opponents, punishing family or friends of suspected enemies of the regime, and extra-legal use of police or military force against the population. 43 Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons on his own Kurdish population without any particular change or expansion of policies regarding the use of force on his own citizens. They were simply used in an act of governmental terror believed to be expedient in accomplishing Hussein's goals. State involvement in terror. These are activities where government personnel carry out operations using terror tactics. These activities may be directed against other nations' interests, its own population, or private groups or individuals viewed as dangerous to the state. In many cases, these activities are terrorism under official sanction, although such authorization is rarely acknowledged openly. Practical strategies against terrorists require consideration of the terrorist's point of view in his targeting and operations. Understanding the opponent's preferences and capabilities allows better defense and promotes an active approach to the threat. Total interdiction of all possible targets is impossible, since the defender cannot protect everything, while consistent prediction is unlikely. Accurate determination of what risks are acceptable must consider the terrorists' values, particularly their estimate of the target's value and the costs of the operation necessary to successfully hit it. The proliferation of terrorism expertise and the breakdown in restraint and observance of international norms allow many more groups and individuals to use terror as a viable tool. 83 In order to achieve their goals. With more potential terror users, the U.S. will often be a terrorist target for several reasons. There has been an increase in transnational radicalism as compared to recent historical conflicts. As the most prominent secular democracy and largest single economic, military, and political power in the world, the U.S. becomes an easy and appealing target for extremists. Additionally, since the United States declared the global war on terrorism, the U.S. has become the principal opponent of extremists throughout the world. Much of the current thinking and literature on terrorism developed when terrorism was closely tied to revolutionary movements and separatist movements concerned with influencing events in relation to one nation. Newer causes and ideologies, such as religion, economic concerns, or environmental issues, are international, transnational, or even global in scope. Further, the perception that the U.S. is the single most powerful nation in the world invites targeting by terror groups regardless of ideology to demonstrate their power and status. In the worldview of many terrorist groups, the perceived power and influence of the U.S. encourages targeting to force the U.S. to extract concessions from third parties, prisoner release, policy changes, etc. Although some people may question why a comparatively small terrorist group believes it can successfully confront the United States, part of the answer lies in the Afghanistan Jihad fighters and their success against the Soviet Union. Many of these Islamic fighters were persuaded that they alone had defeated the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, even though the U.S. provided substantial support and that they could do the same to the United States. 84 Another reason to expect greater use of terrorism against the U.S. is that possible competitors may feel that they cannot openly challenge or defeat the U.S. with any other technique. Nations have employed state-sponsored terrorism to produce results that could not have otherwise been achieved against U.S. opposition. The current supremacy of American military power leaves adversaries with few options to challenge U.S. interests. Adding non-state groups of formidable capability and few restraints to the roster of potential adversaries of the U.S. increases the likely use of terror against our forces. Many potential adversaries view the U.S. as particularly vulnerable to the psychological impact and uncertainties generated by terror tactics in support of other activities. 85 Terrorism and terror tactics have already been used against U.S. forces in support of conventional and insurgent warfare, as well as against U.S. forces during stability and peace support operations in attempts to influence policy. Lessons drawn from previous uses of terror against the U.S. have led to some commonly held perceptions about the effectiveness and impact of terrorism versus the U.S. Some of these perceptions may or may not be valid, but are still widely held. Consequently, terrorist groups are likely to try to capitalize on what they may perceive as vulnerabilities. They include the beliefs that the U.S. is extremely casualty averse. Any loss of life takes on significance out of proportion to the circumstances. The U.S. government policies and policy makers are overly influenced by public opinion, which in turn is particularly susceptible to the adverse psychological impact of terrorism. The U.S. economic performance is perception-driven. and therefore equally vulnerable to the adverse psychological impact of terrorism. The U.S. cannot sustain long-term efforts or exhibit public sacrifice in pursuit of difficult national goals. Finally, the growing polarization of some domestic political issues means that the U.S. is also likely to see increased terror attacks on its own soil by a variety of homegrown groups. These groups may target U.S. forces either as symbols, sources of weapons and equipment, or at the behest of other terrorist groups in exchange for money or support elsewhere. Contrary to the oft-repeated charge that terrorism is a product of poverty and despair, terrorists are most commonly from middle-class backgrounds, with some actually coming from extreme wealth and privilege, while guerrilla fighters and gang members often come from poor and disadvantaged backgrounds, and may adopt terrorism as a tactic. Terrorist groups that specifically organize as such generally come from middle and upper social and economic strata. The leadership may use less educated and socially dispossessed people to conduct acts of terrorism. Even in terrorist groups that espouse the virtues of the people or the proletariat, leadership consists primarily of those of middle-class backgrounds. However, this characteristic must be considered in context with the society the terrorist originates from. Middle class or privilege are relative terms and will, for example, mean completely different levels of income between West Africa and Western Europe. Intentions of terrorist groups shall produce widespread fear. They'll obtain worldwide, national or local recognition for their cause by attracting the attention of the media. Harass, weaken, or embarrass government security forces so that the government overreacts and appears repressive. Steal or extort money and equipment, especially weapons and ammunition. Destroy facilities or disrupt lines of communication in order to create doubt that the government can provide for and protect its citizens. Discourage foreign investments, tourism or assistance programs that can affect the target country's economy and support of the government in power. Influence government decisions, legislation, or other critical decisions. Free prisoners. Satisfy vengeance. It is not possible within the constraints of this subcourse to discuss in detail the nuances of each and every shade of communist sub-ideology. We will concentrate, therefore, on those subordinate leftist ideologies which are most often espoused by left-wing terrorists and their organizations. Marxist/Leninist is what most people think of when we discuss communist terrorist groups. In the early days of Lenin's political activism, he put forward the theory that the use of terrorism was sometimes justified in the furtherance of a just cause, communist revolution. Terrorism might or might not be necessary to bring about and win the revolution, but it would be used without reservation if it were felt that such a tactic was required. Lenin's philosophy included subversion of targeted governments, encouraging revolution by the masses, or even, if deemed desirable for his cause, peaceful coexistence with non-communist countries. In any event, all political activity, including the use of terrorism, would be subordinate to and under the control of the primary communist political organization. This particular ideology was the guiding principle of the Soviet Union from the 1918 revolution until 1991, when the Communist Party was overthrown. In today's society, we find 75 to 85% of all terrorist groups following the Marxist/Leninist ideology. Leon Trotsky, born Lev Bronstein, a disciple and close confidant of Lenin, played a major role in winning the revolution and the ensuing civil war in the Soviet Union. Trotsky's philosophy on the use of terror differed radically from that of Lenin and Stalin. Trotsky believed that world revolution in all non-communist countries should be immediate, that the Soviet Union should inspire and use terrorism to the greatest degree in bringing about such immediate revolution, and that every political communist organization should have and use its own terrorist element. Trotsky condemned any idea of political coexistence with non-communist forms of government and considered Lenin's policy of subversion from within to be too slow and ideologically impure to further the cause of world revolution. Trotsky, who came in the distant second to Stalin in the power struggle after Lenin's death, was later assassinated by the KGB in Mexico City, Mexico. His philosophy, however, has lived on in some of the more radical elements of the extreme left-wing. Mao said to have received his political education in the Soviet Union during its early days. He left the overthrow of the Imperial Chinese government and later the successful Communist Revolution against the Kuomintang, the ruling political party in China, led by Chiang Kai-shek. Mao is considered by many to be the father of modern subversive insurgency and revolution. Whereas the communist revolution in Russia began in the cities and spread to the countryside, revolution in China, under Mao, began in the countryside and then spread to the centers of population. Although Marx and Engels preached that worldwide communist revolution would evolve in industrialized capitalistic societies, Mao taught that such movements would best succeed in agrarian societies in what we now refer to as the Third World. Mao believed that communism could not and should not coexist with other forms of government. Like Trotsky, he encouraged the extensive use of terrorism as a primary tool in bringing about worldwide revolution by the masses. Mao took Trotsky's ideas a step further, however, in his belief that even after the revolution had been won, terrorism should continue as an instrument to enforce Communist Party purity. A glaring example of Mao's philosophy was the Cultural Revolution in China during the 1960s, which all but returned China to the Stone Age. The Maoist philosophy of terrorism is considered to be the most violent and indiscriminate of all leftist subgroups. Fidel Castro and his chief of staff, Ernesto Che Guevara, adhered to the mainline Marxist/Leninist view of revolution. However, they, like Mao, adapted it to a rural setting, thus frequently using urban terrorist tactics in conjunction with rural activity. It is their example which is now followed in most but not all of the subversive insurgent groups in Latin America. Today's anarchist/nihilist terrorist groups believe in and strive for the complete destruction of Western society as we know it. Many espouse support for and belief in communist imperialism for the good of the masses of the world. In reality, however, they propose only to destroy the targeted governments and other social institutions without advocating any real form of replacement government. They do not truly want revolution, only destruction. The number of American and West European terrorist groups, the Red Army faction, RAF for example, are of this way of thinking. The best way to summarize this ideology is to quote from a RAF statement: "Society is corrupt. It must be destroyed. That which comes later will be better." In specific terms, the major difference between anarchism and nihilism is that while anarchism calls for the destruction of existing governments and their controls, nihilism demands all of that in addition to destruction of all existing social institutions and structures. Right-wing terrorist organizations are not quite as varied in their political and philosophical outlook as left-wing terrorist groups. It would be a mistake, however, to consider them as a philosophical and political entity. There are subtle and some not so subtle variations in outlook, nature, and purpose among the right-wing groups, just as there are among the left-wing groups. Within the right-wing, North American groups are almost homogeneous in their rather modified view of reality, while European and Latin American groups tend to follow rather more closely the examples of Hitler and Mussolini. The neo-Nazi outlook on life is modeled after that of the National Socialist German Workers' Party and thus the Nazi of Adolf Hitler. It has two distinct focal points: nationalism and racism. The nationalistic part of neo-Nazism considers both an economic system, state-controlled means of production, and militarism. Most neo-Nazi groups emulate some form of Hitler's militaristic uniforms and mannerisms. There is a strong tendency toward the wearing of tan or brown uniforms, complete with Sam Browne belts, the traditional armband, and use of the Nazi stiff-arm salute. Some American groups have even established Hitler shrines for an almost religious worship of Adolf Hitler. Extreme nationalism, which advocates coexistence, believes that the current government is controlled by communists, socialists, and Jews. An excellent illustration of extreme beliefs is the American neo-Nazis' description of the United States government as the Zionist occupation government viewed an entity upon which they have declared war. The proposed neo-Nazi system somewhat resembles that of the extreme left, with its centralized government and or party control of the economy and major means of production. The other major tenet of Nazism, and by extension neo-Nazism, is racism. This includes both the claiming of racial superiority by their own group and proclaiming that inferior races, Jews, blacks, and others must be either subordinated or exterminated. In the case of European and American neo-Nazis, the Aryan race, defined as those of German, Scandinavian, Dutch, and English/Irish/Scotch descent, are genetically superior and destined to rule over all those of any other extraction. The major difference between European and American neo-Nazi groups is that American groups do not stress the economic aspects of Nazism, but rather usually portend or quasi-religious justification for their beliefs and actions. In particular, some American groups have reinterpreted the Bible in such a way as to not only explain but also demand the subjugation of non-Aryan groups and races. Given the implications of this quasi-religious outlook of their code, domestic neo-Nazi terrorist groups must be considered somewhat religiously, as well as politically inspired terrorists. Neo-fascism, modeled on the political ideology of Italy's Mussolini and Spain's Franco, differs very little from Hitler's Nazism in its nationalistic, both economic and militaristic outlook and its emphasis on internal control and order. Neo-fascism, like fascism, lacks the racial extremism of Nazism. Contemporary neo-fascist groups tend to concentrate their attention on restoring the orderly and controlled society they envision as having previously prospered in Italy and Spain. To that end, they attempt to bring about a strong governmental reaction to their terroristic acts, which they believe will result in a fascist police state. They occasionally attempt to credit left-wing groups for their terrorist violence. Today's neo-fascist groups are found mostly in Italy, Spain, France, and a few South American countries. Terrorist groups which might be categorized as nationalist/territorialist inspired are those who are or who might claim to be conducting activities to further the cause of their particular national, ethnic, or racial group, and to achieve independence or autonomy within a given geographic area. There may be and usually is, a secondary political or religious motivation. Although these groups point to a limited geographical area as the focal point of their interest, they usually have no geographical limit to their activities. In fact, their targets may be far removed from what they claim as their homeland. Many such groups have close operational and support ties with other terrorist groups who espouse a variety of political and religious motivations. There are even some who receive support from foreign governments. Although claiming to be motivated by a feeling of nationalism, most such terrorist groups enjoy a much broader base of popular support among the groups they claim to represent than do others who espouse purely political motivations. They are particularly popular among expatriate or emigrant groups of like background living throughout the world. For example, the Provisional Branch of the Irish Republican Army is quite popular among those claiming Irish descent in the United States, particularly in New England and New York, and meets a large percentage of its financial requirements through donations from those supporters. Religious terrorist groups, like political terrorists, claim as their membership those who hold extreme beliefs. They tend to be totally intolerant of any group which does not adhere to their creed. Like their politically inspired counterparts, they can justify or rationalize their actions as only doing what is necessary for a higher purpose. As uncompromising as political extremists may appear to be, they cannot compete in dedication and zeal to the religiously inspired terrorist. Their actions are not only done for the betterment of mankind, they are demanded by God. Unlike political ideology, religious beliefs, particularly fundamentalist beliefs, can and do transcend lesser loyalties such as those to country, ethnic group, political ideologies, and even family ties. Loyalty and dedication to God comes before all else. We are dealing here with the extremes of extremism, bordering on fanaticism. This total dedication by the religiously inspired terrorist places the threat on a higher plane, which requires a new level of understanding. Ideological mercenaries are persons who ply their terrorist trade to the highest bidder. They are ideological in that they limit their clients to those with whom they have at least some political or religious affinity. Persons in this category do not usually form their own groups, nor do they commonly perform terrorist operations on their own. Carlos the Jackal-born Ilipamariz Sanchez is the most widely known ideological mercenary. Born and raised in a devout communist family, Carlos sold his talents only to those terrorist organizations which adhered, at least in general terms, to his particular left-wing extremist philosophy. An example of group mercenaries would be the Japanese Red Army, who conducted numerous operations on behalf of the Palestinians in exchange for terrorist training. Non-ideological mercenary terrorists, like any other mercenary type, earn their daily bread by selling their expertise to the highest bidder. They will perform on a contract basis for any group which has the finances to pay. They have no more regard for political or religious consideration than a plumber, carpenter, or any other person with a marketable trade. It is strictly a business deal, no more and no less. This type is somewhat less common than the ideological mercenary. A few years ago, a Chicago criminal street gang, the El Ken Group, numbering in excess of 1,000 members, offered its services in the field of terrorism to Mr. Gaddafi of Libya for a sum in excess of $1 million. The incident resulted in the conviction and jailing of several members of the group. Politically inspired criminal terrorists are simply those whose motivations are, to at least some extent, both political and criminal. There are numerous examples of such groups, the Aryan Brotherhood baby being but one. The AB, an extensive prison gang operating both inside and outside the penitentiary system, maintains a close affiliation with the Aryan nations and other right-wing extremist groups. Baby members are criminals with a political bend. Their endeavors, both in and out of prison, include extortion, murder for profit, homosexual prostitution, illegal drugs, and armed robbery. AB activities, both political and criminal, tend to target ethnic, racial, and political groups and individuals outside of their affiliation. Other groups involved in the so-called narco-terrorism may have crossed the fine line between a politically inspired terrorist organization using criminal activities to finance their operations to becoming a criminally inspired organization using politics as a rationalization for their criminal activities. The non-politically motivated terrorist is discussed here only for the purpose of pointing out that terrorism is not unique to ideologically motivated groups. Activities of these organizations, although not within the official purview of military intelligence, are of interest from an academic viewpoint because of their effectiveness. The major non-political terrorist organization is the so-called Mafia, the strictly criminal organization which has successfully controlled major portions of Italy through use of terror tactics and which has enjoyed the measure of success in the United States. The Mafia's secret to success is the use of terrorist tactics as a means of controlling large segments of the population through fear, much the same way that a dictatorship uses establishment terrorism to control its subjects. The Mafia uses bombs, assassination, and kidnapping much the same way that any conventional terrorist group does not. Special interest groups, composed of members whose only common denominator may be an almost fanatical concern with a particular issue or interest, have taken to the use of terrorist tactics like a duck to water, anti-nuclear, anti-abortion, peace, and environmentalist groups in particular have adopted terrorist tactics as a legitimate methodology to influence governments and whole societies. Although the participation of special interest groups in terrorist tactics is a relatively recent development, these groups have been responsible for extensive destruction of property, serious injury, and even death to innocent persons. While not usually considered in a discussion of terrorist types and groups, special interest groups can be just as dangerous as any terrorist organization. Some of these organizations are more than willing to wage death and destruction for the betterment of humanity as seen through their eyes. They cannot be ignored. The fourth period of terrorism dates from post-World War II to the present day. This period is seen the rise of national/separatists movements. Examples of these include the conflict in Ireland, the conflict in Palestine, the Sikhs movements for a state of Bengal separate from India, the Eritrean Liberation Front fighting for a separate, independent state within Ethiopia, and the Quebec Liberation Front FLQ fighting for the independence of French Quebec. Wars of national liberation have been numerous. Examples include Kenya, Cyprus, Aden, Algeria, and Rhodesia. Extreme right-wing terrorism also had a resurgence. Examples of these groups include military sports group Hoffmann, former West Germany, the Black Order in Italy, the National Front of the United Kingdom, state-supported terrorism international Uganda, BDM, Haiti, Gervalia family Argentina, Death Squad El Salvador, Death Squad, and the former USSR KGB. The current era differs from previous ones by advances in the technology of weapons, communications, transport, and with the end of colonial times, the onset of an age of numerous movements and wars for freedom, national liberation, and self-determination. With rapid advances in communications technology, terrorists, for the first time, have an opportunity to present their case and cause directly to their target audience through the medium of television. The development of swift, convenient, and inexpensive mass transportation allows the terrorist to travel from country to country with a minimum of bother and inconvenience to set the stage for the evolution of international terrorism. The ready availability of light, efficient and deadly weaponry created a situation where the terrorists were more often than not better armed than the police and security authorities who were expected by society to defeat them. Text. Common elements of terrorism. There is clearly a wide choice of definitions for terrorism. Despite this, There are elements in common among the majority of useful definitions. Common threads of the various definitions identify terrorism as political, psychological, violent, dynamic, deliberate, political. A terrorist act is a political act or is committed with the intention to cause a political effect.